It's called modern slavery, though there's nothing really modern about it.
Modern slavery is about illegal controls. The chains that hold people today in slavery are no longer physical, but rather they have become psychological.
Now, the latest Walk-Free Global Slavery Index has found 50 million people, including 12 million children, are living in modern slavery, mostly in forced labour or forced marriages. And things are getting worse, with countries like Russia, Saudi Arabia and North Korea forcing another 10 million people into slavery since 2018.
Women are disproportionately affected by modern slavery, particularly sort of in the sex trafficking dimension. Other issues that affect the prevalence of modern slavery relate to, for example, economic precarity, people's vulnerability due to lack of income.
Consumer culture driving the market for human misery, with Americans, the English, Germans and Australians spending big on electronics, clothing and textiles, all through a supply chain propped up by forced labour.
People working in factories in Malaysia, for example, they've described working for 12 to 14-hour days in hot, gruelling conditions, 6 to 7 days a week for less than $2 an hour.
Australia's biggest trading partner, China, also a major culprit.
Fast fashion has been notorious for slavery-like conditions for workers. There's credible evidence of horrific exploitation and forced labour against Uyghur people in China.
So that $4 shirt from a chain store, well, someone's paying a high price and it's not you. And it's not just cheap clothes.
Some of the items that you might not immediately connect with modern slavery, for example, are solar panels, but also garlic and other items such as tomatoes.
While Australia is cited as one of the top 3 countries fighting modern slavery, our system is still far from perfect.
But the Australian Modern Slavery Act asks companies to address the risks in operations and supply chains and basically report on those actions and the progress that they've made. What we need is for the government to step in, for example, by introducing financial penalties for non-compliance.
Experts urging Australia to go further.
It's really on companies to prevent these abuses from occurring and lifting conditions for supply chain workers so that we're not profiting from the exploitation of workers.
Grace Forrest is a director of Walk-Free that produced this report and she joins us now. Grace, there are 40,000 modern slaves living in this country. So what does the life of an Australian slave look like?
Look, people living in modern slavery in Australia and throughout the world are experiencing the systemic removal of their own freedom. This includes things such as forced labour, forced marriage, debt bondage, domestic servitude and state-imposed forced labour. Now, we're not seeing state-imposed forced labour in Australia, but we are seeing all the other forms occurring on our shores. And I think I'd also like to point to the fact that Australia also has over a $17 billion import risk of goods at high risk of being made using forced labour.
Grace, can I just get you to unpack some of the forms, I guess, that this form of modern slavery takes? So when you talk about things like, I think was it debt bondage you used, for example? I don't think people at home hear that and go, oh, I know people in that sort of situation. Like, what does that actually mean? Like, how does someone end up in that situation in a way that we would recognise as actually real?
Yeah, it's a really great question. Tied visa systems throughout the world create an environment where an migrant worker usually is tied to their employer, and too often those workers have to pay to gain a job in a certain country. This puts them in a situation of debt from the day they start their work, and often we see this being heavily exploitative, with people working sometimes for months without receiving any pay, being unable to leave that situation. And obviously the longer it goes on, the harder it is for someone to leave that situation because of the pay that has built up. This report found that migrant workers are 3 times more likely to experience forced labour than non-migrant workers, and debt bondage is one of the means and way people are held captive.
It's really overwhelming to think that we might be complicit in modern slavery, and as consumers it feels like we're a bit powerless. But are there practical things that we can do to be making more ethical choices?
Look, there definitely are. I think, first and foremost, this index has shown us that there are 50 million people living in modern slavery throughout the globe, and this is happening in every country in the world. As consumers, we are connected to products that are being made using forced labour every single day, from our clothing, as I mentioned, to coffee, to sugar. I think that we want consumers to understand that this is a government and business responsibility. We're not trying to put more pressure on consumers in a cost of living crisis, but there are practical things that each of us can do. Asking questions about the origins of where our clothes come from is an essential part of this, because without transparency, we cannot see or protect vulnerable people. And if a business can't show you that they're doing the right thing, we'd strongly encourage you to realise that they're doing the wrong thing.
All right, Grace, thank you so much for your time tonight.
Thank you very much.